Practical Anarchy, A Guide to Self-Determination, Dicky. Section 17, Anarchism under Fascism and Communism. The middle decades of the 20th century brought storms like anything anarchism had faced before. Fascism and Stalinism rose almost side by side, each determined to crush any space for independent organisation. Between them, they turned much of Europe and beyond into terrain where anarchism could barely survive above ground. In Italy, Mussolini came to power in 1922 on the back of violence against unions and workers' clubs. Anarchists, syndicalists and socialists were beaten, jailed or killed. Malatesta, already in his 70s, faced repeated house arrests until his death in 1932. The black shirts torched union halls, smashed presses and drove militants underground. In Germany, anarchists were part of the broader left smashed by Hitler's rise. Groups linked to the Free Workers' Union of Germany tried to resist, but the Nazi state was relentless. Many fled, others were sent to concentration camps, their movements erased from public life. In Spain, Franco's victory in 1939 brought executions, mass imprisonment and exile. The CNT and FAI, once millions strong, were driven out of the country. Thousands of Spanish anarchists ended up in refugee camps in France, then some in Nazi camps, while others carried the struggle into exile communities in France, the UK and Latin America. On the other side, Stalin's Soviet Union also crushed anarchists wherever they could be found. After Kronstadt and the defeat of the Machnowites, the last anarchist voices in Russia were silenced. In the 1930s, Stalin's purges wiped out not only Trotskyists, but also anarchists and other non-party radicals. For anarchists, the Soviet Union proved what Bakunin had warned, that a dictatorship of the proletariat would end up in dictatorship, full stop. Even outside Europe, anarchism was squeezed by authoritarian currents. In China, the rising Communist Party pushed anarchists aside by the late 1920s. In Latin America, waves of military repression weakened the once mighty syndicalist federations. Yet anarchism did not vanish. Underground presses continued to circulate. Refugees carried their ideas into exile networks, keeping contact through letters, journals and clandestine meetings. In France, the underground press during the Nazi occupation included anarchist voices. In Italy, militants joined partisan resistance groups. In Spain, guerrilla bands of Marquis carried out sabotage against Franco well into the 1950s, blowing up railway lines, ambushing police and keeping alive the memory of 1936. The anarchist Marquis in southern France often linked up with broader resistance networks, using their knowledge of clandestine organisation as sabotage. Spanish anarchists who had fled Franco crossing back over the Pyrenees to strike at fascist forces, keeping up the fight long after the world's attention had moved elsewhere. These guerrillas rarely made headlines, but for decades they carried the flame of anti-authoritarian resistance. Another form of resistance came through refusal. In both world wars, anarchists were prominent among conscientious objectors, those who refused conscription and imprisonment in the name of principle. In the UK, the non-conscription fellowship included anarchists who endured prison and hard labour rather than obey the state's demand to fight. In the US, Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman were jailed for opposing the draft in 1913, while anarchist and pacifist circles around the War Resisters League carried the refusal into the Second World War. Some anarchists did fight against fascism in Spain and later in partisan groups, but others held fast to the conviction that the state could never order them to kill. The price of resistance was high: exile, prison, torture, execution. But anarchism endured as a living current even in its darkest hour. By the end of the Second World War it seemed battered, scattered and marginal. Yet in the rubble of bombed cities and the new order of Cold War blocs, small groups began again to sow seeds of resistance. The countercultures of the late 20th century would inherit those seeds, turning survival into revival. The middle of the century left anarchism scarred, driven underground by fascist terror and communist authoritarianism. Yet it was never extinguished. Seeds survived in exile communities, in guerrilla bands, in prison notebooks, in whispered stories of refusal. By the 1960s, those seeds would sprout. Hey, guys, shut up. Guys, stop it! Sorry, that's my two cats just about to fight each other. Small groups began again to sow seeds for resist. Right. Middle of the century left anarchism scarred, driven underground by fascist terror and communist authoritarianism. Yet it was never extinguished. Seeds survived in exile communities, in guerrilla bands, in prison notebooks, and whispered stories of refusal. By the 1960s, those seeds would sprout again, this time in the streets, campuses and counterculture of the new generation. In the first half of the century was a tale of repression. The second would show revival. Cats, who'd have them? Right, section 18, post-war revival, counterculture and direct action. By the 1960s, anarchism, though weakened by decades of repression, began to re-emerge in new and unexpected ways. It no longer centred only on unions or formal groups, but seeped through youth culture, protest camps and countercultural experiments. From Paris in 1968 to Stonehenge in the 1980s, people rediscovered anarchism not as theory alone, but as lived practice. May 1968 in Paris lit the spark most dramatically. Students and workers occupied universities, factories and whole districts, rejecting not only government, but the entire system of hierarchy and alienation. Graffiti on the walls summed up the spirit. Be realistic, demand the impossible. Though fractured, the movement was infused with anarchist methods, assemblies, spontaneous action, and anti-authoritarian refusal to be represented by leaders. The Free Festival movement in the UK carried this energy into fields. What began as countercultural gatherings in the late 1960s grew into sprawling zones of music, improvisation and temporary community by the 1970s. Stonehenge became the epicentre, an annual gathering where buses, teepees and tarpaulins made a function in town without permits, landlords or police. For many, festivals were practical anarchism, self-determinism, gift economies, food kitchens and collective decision-making. Out of the culture grew the Peace Convoy, the loose network of New Age travellers who carried the spirit of Stonehenge on the road. Convoys were moving communes, linking festivals, protest sites and squats, creating lives largely outside the wage economy and state structures. Their vehicles became homes, workshops, creches and kitchens. Everyday life was anarchist practice, pooled resources, improvised repairs, collective childcare, shared defence against police harassment. As one traveller later recalled, we lived a gift economy before we knew the term. Repression soon followed. The Battle of the Beanfield in June 1985 marked a turning point. Hundreds of police in riot gear ambushed the convoy en route to Stonehenge, smashing vehicles, beating travellers and arresting over 500 people. The brutality was justified in the press as restoring order, but for anarchists and travellers it was naked proof of how threatened the state felt by autonomy. A decade later, the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994 directly targeted travellers and ravers, banning gatherings with repetitive beats and giving police sweeping powers of eviction. These laws showed how repression was codified to dismantle self-organising communities. Yet repression pushed culture into new forms. Travellers fused with underground rave crews, creating massive free parties like Castlemoreton in 1992, where tens of thousands gathered for days in open fields. Sound systems became mobile commons, collective, decentralised and resistant to control. Squatting also flourished in cities like London, Amsterdam and Berlin. In Berlin, after 1989, whole districts of squats in Kreuzberg and Friedrichshain became autonomous zones, hubs of anarchist organising, art and resistance. Across the Atlantic, anarchist ideas also resurfaced in the US. The Beat generation of the 1950s rejected consumer culture and conformity, experimented with communal living, jazz clubs and spontaneous art. They're not explicitly anarchist, their refusal of authority fed into the radical politics of the 1960s. The Yippies, the Youth International Party founded by Abbe Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, brought anarchist theatre to the streets, turning protest into carnivals of resistance during the Vietnam War era. They blurred politics and spectacle, running a pig for president in 1968 in Occupy Wall Street to throw dollar bills at the trading floor. Black anarchism also grew during this period, both alongside and against the Black Power movement. While the Black Panthers famously adopted a vanguardist model, other voices argue for decentralised community-led struggle. Thinkers like Lorenzo Comboa Irvin and Ashanti Alston pushed explicitly anarchist perspectives, anti-racist, anti-capitalism, anti-state, rooted in black radical traditions of self-defence and mutual aid. Their work connected anarchism with struggles against white supremacy and colonialism, widening its scope beyond the predominantly white counterculture into everyday life. Crass, Conflict and later bands like Radical Dance Faction linked music directly into politics, anti-war, anti-capitalism and anti-state. The DIY ethic of punk mirrored the practices of squats and convoys, records pressed collectively, gigs held in community, spaces, scenes, spreading ideas and tactics. Women's movements revitalised anarchist organising in the 1980s. Green and Common Women's Peace Camp, set up in the 1981 against nuclear weapons, ran on consensus, living and direct action. Its practices were explicitly anti-hierarchical and prefigurative, showing that the struggle was not only against weapons but against patriarchy itself. The same spirit carried into environmental networks. Earth First, anti-road campaigns and protest camps like Twyford Down used tree sits, tunnels and blockades to resist development, practising anarchism through ecological defence. By the close of the 20th century, anarchism had shifted form. It was not a simple mass organisation, but a patchwork of squats, convoys, sound systems, peace camps and protest sites. Its fields and forests, on the roads and in the cities, it lived as counterculture, practical experiments in autonomy. Against police batons, hostile laws and media demonisation, people carved out zones of freedom, often precarious, but definitely real. Section 19. Everyday Anarchies into the late 20th century. By the late 20th century, anarchism lived as much in kitchens, neighbourhoods and co-ops as in squats or protest camps. Away from the headlines, countless small practices kept anti-authoritarian culture alive. Housing and food cooperatives allowed people to live outside landlord control and supermarket chains. Collective ownership schemes gave tenants and workers a say in how resources were managed. Some were explicitly political, others simply practical, but in both cases they showed that everyday life could be organised without hierarchy. Workers' collectives and co-ops sprung up in industries from printing to cafes, often inspired by anarchist or libertarian socialist traditions. Decision-making was horizontal, profits reinvested, and labour shared. They rarely toppled capitalism, but they built islands of autonomy within it. Neighbourhood networks also carried anarchist echoes. Informal childcare groups, local mutual aid schemes and community kitchens offered solidarity when state services failed or were withdrawn under austerity. These weren't always labelled anarchist, but they embodied its core principle, people helping one another without bosses or bureaucracy. Direct action in this era was not only about blockades and protests, but about creating everyday alternatives. Bicycle repair workshops, community gardens and free schools spread across cities, offering practical resources without charge or hierarchy. These spaces normalised cooperation and self-management, often quietly, without the drama of street clashes. Beyond Europe, everyday anarchists flourished wherever communities needed to organise without relying on the state. In the US, black mutual aid traditions deepened into explicitly anarchist practice through groups like Black Autonomy Collective and activists such as Lorenzo Comboa Irvin, who argued that grassroots community control was a form of everyday rebellion against white supremacy. In Latin America, neighbourhood assemblies in Argentina provided food and healthcare in times of economic crisis, linking older anarchist currents to new survival strategies. Across Asia, anarchist-inspired community schools and workers' co-ops carried the same ethos into places where open politics was dangerous. Moments of social crisis revealed how deep these everyday anarchies ran. During strikes, blackouts or disasters, people organised themselves, pooling resources, sharing food, protecting neighbours. In the 1981 Brixton uprising, often framed as a riot, also showed communities asserting autonomy in the face of state hostility. In such moments, solidarity was not abstract but immediate, lived in action. Everyday anarchies in the late 20th century did not look like revolutions. They looked like meals cooked collectively, tenants managing their own housing, neighbours refusing eviction, volunteers keeping a kitchen running on donations. Small, fragile, and sometimes fleeting, they nonetheless built infrastructures of resistance. These practices sustained anarchist culture for an era when overt revolutionary movements were often crushed, ensuring that when larger waves of protest rose again, the foundations were already in place. Sorry about the cats. They're a pain in the neck.